During a family vacation, my husband's parents insisted I sit at a separate table. Then his mother said, "You're just the womb, not family." I stood up, smiled, and said something that made her drop her wine glass. The whole resort heard what came next. You won't believe what happened next. My name is Jenna Barrett, and I'm 38 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, with my 7-year-old daughter, Layla. Well, I did. At least, before everything changed. For 9 years, I was married to Colin Barrett. On paper, we were a picture-perfect couple. A stable marriage, a charming suburban home with a wrap-around porch, and a beautiful little girl who adored both of her parents. We met in our late 20s through mutual friends. And for the first few years, Colin was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: affectionate, reliable, and charming in an understated way. But marriage has a funny way of revealing things. People don't change overnight. The cracks just grow wider. The truth is, Colin always had a habit of being a bit spineless when it came to his family. And by his family, I mean his parents, Frank and Diane Barrett. Frank was the quieter of the two, a stiff man with a permanent frown, and a thinning head of white hair that he always slicked back with too much gel. He was practical to the point of being cold, always checking his watch and speaking in clipped, disapproving tones. I used to wonder if he had a pulse at all. Diane, though. She was the one who really made my skin crawl. She was one of those perfectly coiffed pearl-wearing women who thrived on condescension. You could be standing in her pristine, lavender-scented kitchen, and she'd offer you a cup of coffee with the same tone you'd use for a homeless man, begging on the corner. I tolerated them for years. I smiled through their backhanded compliments at Christmas dinners and gritted my teeth when Diane made snide remarks about my cooking. It was easier that way. For Colin's sake. For Layla, I believed I could manage them until the Florida vacation. It was supposed to be a family getaway, a week at a high-end resort in Key West. It was Colin's idea. He pitched it over breakfast one morning, while Layla was picking the marshmallows out of her cereal. He painted it like a dream, a chance for us to spend quality time together. Just us. But 2 weeks before we were set to leave, Colin casually mentioned that his parents would be coming along. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when he said it. His voice was so casual, I almost didn't process the words. Wait, what? I turned, still holding the damp cloth. He didn't look up from his phone. Yeah, my parents are coming. I mentioned the trip, and they seemed excited. It's been years since they've been anywhere nice. I stared at him. Colin, this was supposed to be our family vacation. You, me, and Layla. He gave me a disarming smile, the same one he always used when he wanted to smooth things over. It was like their family. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Colin had already turned his attention back to his phone. I felt the anger tighten in my chest, but swallowed it down. It was easier that way. It always was. The resort was stunning, the kind of place that was too expensive to ever be described as quaint. Towering palm trees swayed along the edge of the private beach, and a long infinity pool stretched toward the horizon. The staff wore matching white polos and greeted everyone with identical, overly bright smiles. At first, I tried to enjoy it. I really did. I was having the time of her life. She spent hours splashing in the pool, her hair clinging to her forehead, shrieking with laughter as she practiced her cannonballs. But the moment we checked in, Diane started in on me. She eyed my simple sundress, the one I had specifically picked for comfort in the humid Florida heat, and gave me one of her pinched, artificial smiles. Oh, she said lightly, you're wearing that. I glanced down at my dress. It was a light yellow cotton maxi dress, nothing fancy, but perfectly appropriate for a resort. Yeah, I replied, forcing a tight smile. It's comfortable. She hummed softly and glanced at Colin, as if expecting him to agree with her unspoken judgment. He didn't say anything. He just rubbed the back of his neck and looked away. That was the first crack. It was the third evening of the trip when everything changed. We were supposed to have dinner at one of the resort's beachfront restaurants. It was an open-air place with tiki torches and wooden tables carved from driftwood. The sun was just beginning to set, casting everything in soft, golden hues. We arrived together, but before I could say anything, Diane walked ahead and waved down the hostess. Table for 4, please. She said with a syrupy smile, gesturing toward herself, Frank, Colin, and Layla. The hostess glanced at the 5 of us and frowned slightly. A table for 5, you mean? She asked, clearly confused. Diane turned back toward me with that tight, patronizing smile of hers, the one she always wore before she said something cruel. Oh, she said lightly, placing a delicate hand on my arm. You don't mind sitting separately, do you? The resort is so busy tonight. I'm sure you understand. I blinked, thinking, no, she can't be serious. I turned to Colin, silently begging him with my eyes to say something, anything. But he just shifted uncomfortably and ran his hand along the back of his neck, pretending not to notice. Of course, I said softly. My voice barely sounded like my own. The hostess led them to a beautiful windowside table with a view of the beach. Then she took me to a smaller, isolated table by the bar. It was barely big enough for 2 people. I sat there alone, staring at the condensation pooling around the base of my water glass. I had no appetite. My hands shook slightly as I stirred the straw in my untouched drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass. When I glanced over at their table, Layla was laughing at something Frank said. Diane was smiling, her hand casually resting on Colin's wrist as she leaned in to share some snide comment. Colin glanced at her. Then at me, just for a fleeting moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he looked away. And I sat there, blinking back tears, wondering how the ally had let things come to this. The next night, we had dinner together again. This time, I was allowed to sit at the same table, but part of me almost wished they had excluded me again. Diane was in rare form. Throughout the meal, she made her usual snide comments. She was subtle enough to make them pass her playful banter, but the underlying venom was unmistakable. Oh, Jenna, you should really ask the chef for a few pointers. Colin's always raving about your pasta, but this is exceptional. She smiled sweetly and took a delicate sip of wine. A few minutes later, she turned to Layla and ran her fingers through her hair. Your eyes are so blue, just like your daddy's. Thank goodness you didn't get my boring brown ones. She said with a dramatic wink, pointedly ignoring the fact that Layla's eyes were exactly the same shade as mine. They clenched my hands under the table until my knuckles went white. And then she said it. She swirled her wine lazily. Her gaze fixed on me with a look of mild boredom. You know, Jenna, you're just the womb. Not really family. For a moment, the whole world went silent. The clink of silverware against plates. The low murmur of conversation. It all faded. I stared at her. My heart thudding violently against my ribs. Colin glanced at me, but said nothing. Not a word. I stood slowly. My chair scraping against the tile floor. My hands trembled, but I forced them to steady. I smiled. A genuine radiant smile. And I said loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. Well, Diane, since I'm just the womb, you should know that your son has been sleeping with someone else's womb for the past 3 years. Her hand jerked violently, knocking over her wine glass. It shattered against the marble floor, and the entire restaurant fell into stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the faint clatter of the wine glass shards, settling against the marble floor. The crimson wine pooled like blood around the base of the table leg, staining the pristine white linen napkin that had fallen beside it. Diane's face drained of color so rapidly. I thought she might faint. Her perfectly manicured fingers, still gripping the stem of her fork, had gone stiff. Her knuckles were bone white. The delicate little muscles around her mouth twitched slightly, as though she were trying to form words, but couldn't quite remember how. Across the table, Frank slowly placed his mop hat down on the edge of his plate. His eyes narrowed slightly, the same cold, analytical look he probably gave insurance fraud cases back when he was still a corporate lawyer. His jaw clenched once, but otherwise he remained motionless. And then there was Colin. His head jerked toward me so quickly, the veins in his neck stood out. His eyes widened in disbelief. His face, already ruddy from the Florida heat and the wine, turned an alarming shade of blotchy red. For a split second, he just stared at me, blinking rapidly, as if he could somehow blink away what I had just said. But he couldn't. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on us. The other diners, people who had only moments before been laughing over their grilled mahamahi and clinking their glasses, were now frozen. Some openly stared. Others glanced sideways with poorly disguised curiosity. A man at the next table cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting in his chair. A woman across the room discreetly lowered her fork. Her gaze locked on us. Diane recovered first. Well, almost. She drew in a sharp breath through her nose. Her lips parting slightly, but nothing came out. Her throat bobbed as she tried to swallow. She glanced around quickly. Her eyes wild and darting like a trapped animal searching for an escape route. And then she turned to Colin. Her voice was a strangled whisper. Shake you with disbelief. Colin, her eyes were wide and pleading, demanding an immediate denial. Lie for me. They seemed to say, fix this, but Colin didn't speak. His mouth was slightly open, his lower lip trembling faintly, but no words came. His eyes flicked toward mine for a fraction of a second. He swallowed hard. And I saw it. The tiniest flicker of guilt in his eyes. It flashed across his face and was gone just as quickly. Diane noticed it too. Her expression shattered. She slowly turned back toward me, blinking rapidly as if trying to clear fogged glasses. "That's not true," she said quietly. Her voice a raspy, trembling whisper. She glanced around the restaurant quickly, her eyes skimming the faces of the onlookers, desperate for anyone to share in her disbelief. "She's lying." I let out a low, breathless laugh. "Oh, Diane," I said softly. My voice almost pitiful. "I'm not lying." I reached into my purse. My fingers trembling slightly with adrenaline, pulled out my phone. I unlocked it with a swipe of my thumb and scrolled to the photos. My hand was steady when I turned the screen toward her. There he was. Colin, shirtless, standing barefoot in a dimly lit cabin, living room, a pair of unbuttoned jeans slung low on his hips. His arms were wrapped around Neela, the woman I had only met once in passing at Colin's office, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator with a chestnut-colored bob and a pixie-like face. She had one leg hitched around his waist. They were pressed together in the kind of messy, tangled embrace that left nothing to the imagination. I swiped to the next photo. Colin's car parked in front of a small, secluded cabin at Lake Lure, the same cabin they had rented for their monthly weekend getaways for nearly 3 years. Then came the text messages. Dozens of them. I had saved them all. Every single one. "I can't wait to see you. Jenna is so clueless. She thinks I'm at a conference this weekend. God, I hate going home to her after being with you. You're all I think about. I promise, baby. 1 more year, and I'll leave her." I scrolled slowly, deliberately, watching as Diane's eyes flicked back and forth over the damning evidence. Her mouth opened slightly. A small, broken sound escapes her throat. She stared at the phone in my hand, unblinking. The screen's glow, illuminating her pale face. And then, without warning, she pushed back from the table violently, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. It nearly tipped over. She pressed a hand to her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her eyes were wide, glassy. Her wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, falling to the floor and shattering against the tile with a sharp, musical clatter. The deep red liquid pooled beneath her chair, seeping into the pristine fabric of her white linen napkin. She pushed past the waiter who rushed over, holding a small stack of towels. She didn't even glance at him. She just staggered away from the table, her heels clacking unevenly against the marble. Her hands were trembling. "Diane," Colin's voice was raw, low, but she didn't look back. Frank rose slowly, his movements deliberate and mechanical. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. Then slowly placed them back on. Without a word, he turned and followed his wife out of the restaurant. Colin and I were alone at the table. For the first time since I had made my announcement, he looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with something between fury and desperation. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles on the side of his face twitched slightly. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven bursts. "Jenna," he said hoarsely, his voice low and urgent. "What the hell are you doing?" I exhaled slowly through my nose, feeling a strange, unexpected calm settle over me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I simply stared at him, the weight of 3 years of deceit sitting heavily between us. "You let your mother humiliate me for years," I said quietly, my voice low but steady. "You sat there while she called me a womb. You said nothing. Not once." His eyes flashed with something sharp and defensive. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone." "Oh, I did." My voice was sharp now. Steady, firm. "I really did." He opened his mouth again, but I was already rising from the table slowly, deliberately. My hands were steady as I picked up my purse. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral. Calm. I turned toward the entrance of the restaurant, barely hearing the low murmur of voices, the clink of silverware, the awkward rustle of napkin. I felt dozens of eyes follow me as I walked toward the exit. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, but my hands were trembling slightly by the time I stepped into the humid floor tonight. The warm, sticky air clung to my skin, making it feel heavier somehow, almost suffocate. My legs moved automatically, carrying me down the winding stone path that led toward the resort's private beach. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed air, space, distance. The soft hiss of the waves grew louder as I approached the shore. A light breeze stirred the palm fronds overhead, making them rustle faintly. The sky was painted in streaks of lavender and burnt orange, the last remnants of the sunset clinging stubbornly to the horizon. I pulled off my sandals and let my bare feet sink into the cool, damp sand. I stared out at the endless stretch of ocean, barely registering the gentle pull of the tide washing over my ankles. My hands were still trembling slightly, so I clenched them into fists and pressed them hard against my thighs, trying to steady myself. I stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon, barely blinking. My chest felt tight, too tight. I stacked in shallow breaths, but it wasn't enough. The adrenaline was still flooding my system, making my limbs feel light and shaky. My heart hammered violently in my chest, a deep, dull pounding that I could feel all the way down to my fingertips. Somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps, soft at first, muffled by the sand, but deliberate. I knew who it was before I turned around. Jenna, his voice was low, hoarse, almost pleading. I kept my back to him. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I just let the waves lap at my feet, waiting. The footsteps slowed, then stopped a few feet behind me. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the water rushing over the shore and the distant clink of glasses from the resort's outdoor bar. I stared straight ahead at the place where the sky met the sea, the colors smearing together into a dusky haze. Jenna, Colin said again, his voice quieter this time. I finally turned to face him. His eyes were bloodshot. His face was slightly pale, almost ashen, and his breathing was uneven. His shirt was untucked and slightly rumpled. He had clearly left the restaurant in a hurry. For a fleeting second, I noticed that his hands were trembling too. We stared at each other, silent and unmoving. For once, he didn't reach for me. He didn't try to touch my arm or my wrist, the way he used to when he wanted to soften an argument. This time, he just stood there, his hands dangling at his sides, useless. His mouth opened slightly as if he were about to speak, but nothing came out. I let out a slow breath, my eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't," I said softly, shaking my head just once. He flinched slightly, like I had slapped him. His mouth pressed into a thin line. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, a habit of his when he was stressed. His fingers pulled at the roots just slightly, the way they always did when he was frustrated or losing control of a situation, but this wasn't a situation he could control. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The ocean surged and fell behind me, steady and ceaseless as though the whole earth itself was breathing. Finally, Colin took a slow step forward. His voice was soft, measure, the same voice he used when he was talking to Layla, after she had scraped her knee, or when he was on the phone with a client. Carefully composed, "Can we?" He swallowed. "Can we just talk?" The words hung in the air for a moment, empty and weightless. I let out a soft, bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Now you want to talk?" My voice was barely above a whisper. His throat bobbed slightly. "I know you're angry." I let out a sharp, breathless exhale, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My eyes narrowed slightly, and I crossed my arms over my chest. "Angry?" I repeated softly, my voice trembling slightly. I shook my head slowly. "No, Colin, I'm not angry." His eyes flickered slightly, with confusion. I took a slow step toward him, dropping my arms back to my sides. My voice was calm, steady. "I'm done." The word landed between us like a physical blow. I watched the breath leave his chest, his shoulders sagging slightly as he stared at me. "No, you're not," he said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. His eyes were wide now, desperate. "You're just upset, you're emotional. You didn't mean to do that in there." I meant every word." The color drained from his face slightly. I shook my head slowly, staring at him in disbelief. 3 years. I said quietly, my voice almost shaking with incredulity. 3 goddamn years, Colin. Do you know how long I stared at those text messages? Do you know how many times I convinced myself I was overreacting? How many nights I sat in bed next to you, wondering if I was just being paranoid? Thinking maybe I was imagining it? 3 years of looking at you and wondering how the Asia I didn't see it sooner. His jaw clenched tightly. You didn't mean for me to find out." My voice was sharp now, each word slicing through the space between us. "You didn't mean for me to see the pictures. You didn't mean for me to know." His eyes flashed with something desperate. His voice cracked slightly. "It didn't mean anything." I let out a breathless, bitter laugh. I felt my throat tighten painfully, but I didn't look away. "Didn't mean anything," I repeated softly. My voice broke slightly at the end. "Colin, you built a whole separate life with her. Do you even what the aisle it's like to spit across from your own husband and wonder if he's thinking about someone else every time he looks at you? Every single time you touched me. I thought about her hands on you and you," my voice wavered. You looked me in the eyes every day and let me believe you were still mine. He let out a shaky breath and took a step closer. Jenna, please. His voice. It wasn't. It's over. Okay. I ended it months ago. It meant nothing. I stared at him for a long moment and then slowly I shook my head. You meant nothing, Colin. I saw the words hit him like a slap. His face twisted slightly with pain. His mouth falling open slightly. His eyes were wide. Bloodshot. And for the first time they looked broken for a brief flickering moment. I thought I saw regret in them. Not guilt, regret, but it didn't matter anymore. I felt my throat tighten and my chest constrict sharply with emotion. But I didn't let the tears fall not in front of him. I turned away from him slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing heavily against my chest. The sand was cool and damp beneath my feet as I took a few unsteady steps away from him back toward the resort. I heard his voice behind me soft, raw, barely more than a whisper. Jenna, please. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. I kept walking along the shoreline, my feet sinking into the damp uneven sand with each step. The night had grown darker and the ocean was nothing more than an endless, inky expanse stretching out before me. The faint outline of the resort glowed in the distance. Its string lights twinkling like tiny fireflies against the darkness. Behind me, I could still hear Colin's uneven breathing, but his footsteps had stopped. He wasn't following me anymore. He was just standing there, watching me walk away. For the first time in years, I didn't care if he came after me. The sand grew cooler as I neared the wooden walkway that led back to the resort. I took my time climbing the steps, letting my hands trail along the sun-warmed railing. My legs felt heavier with every step, as if the weight of everything, the lies, the humiliation, the betrayal, was slowly settling into my limbs. By the time I reached the edge of the pool deck, my hands had stopped trembling. I made my way through the clusters of vacationers lounging around the bar. Their laughter and clinking glasses blurring into a faint, meaningless hum. A waiter passed by, with a tray of drinks, and for a brief moment, I considered grabbing one, but my throat felt too tight to swallow anything. Instead, I kept walking, straight back to our suite. When I woke the next morning, the bed beside me was empty. The sheets were slightly rumbled, the Colin was gone. For a few seconds, I stared at the indentation where his body had been, my eyes tracing the faint wrinkles in the fabric. The pillows still smelled faintly of his shampoo, a clean, woodsy scent that once made me feel safe. Now, it made my stomach turn. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and sat there for a moment. Pressing the heels of my hands against my temples. My head was still foggy from the night before, but my mind was clear. Crystal clear, I wasn't going to cry. Not now, not today. I heard the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway, just as I was slipping on a lightweight linen dress. A moment later, the door swung open, and Layla came bounding into the room, still in her pajamas, her blonde hair, a messy halo of curls. Mommy, she chirped, throwing her arms around my waist. We're going to the beach today. I ran my fingers through her hair, holding her close. The warmth of her small arms around me was enough to push down the lump forming in my throat. I crouched slightly to meet her eyes. Actually, sweetheart, I said softly, brushing a few strands of hair from her forehead. How would you feel about heading home a little early? Her brows furrowed slightly. Home? I nodded. Yeah, just you and me. For a moment, she seemed confused. She glanced over her shoulder, clearly expecting Colin to walk through the door at any second, holding his coffee and giving her a lazy morning smile. But he didn't, and she didn't ask where he was. She just nodded and slipped her small hand into mine. I checked out of the resort that morning. I didn't tell Colin. I didn't need to. While Layla sat cross-legged on the bed, watching a cartoon on my phone, I calmly packed my bags. I moved slowly and deliberately, folding each sundress and swimsuit with methodical precision. There was no rush. I called for a cab. And when it arrived, I wheeled our suitcase down to the lobby. The woman at the front desk gave me a polite, but slightly confused smile as she pulled up my reservation. Just you checking out? She asked, glancing at the second name in the room. Yes, I said evenly. Just me and my daughter. She smiled politely as if nothing were out of the ordinary and printed my receipt. I kept my sunglasses on as I walked through the resort lobby. I wasn't sure if Diane or Frank would be lurking nearby, but I didn't care. Let them see me leaving. Let them watch. I secured Layla's seatbelt in the cab and kissed the top of her head. Are we going to see Daddy later? She asked innocently as I slid into the seat beside her. I stared out the window for a moment, watching the palm trees blur into streaks of green as the driver pulled out of the resort's long winding driveway. Not today, baby. I said softly. She nodded and turned her attention back to the show playing on my phone. Colin tried to call me later that day. 4 times. I let each one go to voicemail. He sent 3 text messages. The first one was short and confusing. Where are you? You left? The second one was more frantic. Jenna, please, call me. The third was one word. Please. I deleted all 3. 2 days later, back in Asheville, I filed for divorce. I did it quietly without any dramatic phone calls or angry confrontations. I simply met with my lawyer, signed the papers, and handed over the evidence I had collected. The photos, the text messages, the receipts. My lawyer didn't even blink. She had seen cases like this before. She assured me it would be swift. It was. Colin tried to fight me at first. He hired a lawyer and had the audacity to request joint custody of Layla, even though he had barely been present during the past 3 years. But I had anticipated that. I handed over the text messages, the ones where he had casually blown off Layla's ballet recital because he was working late when he had actually been with Mila. I handed over the GPS logs, showing his monthly trips to the cabin, the charges on our joint credit card for the room bookings, the spa treatments, the dinners for 2. Colin's lawyer backed off quickly. The judge didn't take long to decide. I was granted primary custody of Layla. Colin was given visitation rights every other weekend. I didn't ask for alimony. I didn't need it. Instead, I asked for the one thing I knew would destroy him. The help. The one his parents had gifted us as a wedding present. The one that Diane had smugly told me I would never be able to afford on my own. I fought for it. And I won. When the settlement was finalized, I stood on the front lawn watching as Colin loaded his belongings into the back of a moving van. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes were dull and defeated.
Good morning， 早安，妈妈们。借我你那个麦试一下。你们收到了这个 Oxford Dictionary Pen 没有啊 ？E 卡姆斯就是上次 Kobe Daddy 跟这个 E 卡姆斯配合，然后开卖的这个 E 卡姆斯。就是 E 卡姆斯我自己呢也有买一套给我的孩子，然后呢我也买一套。
Diane was there too, standing by the curb, watching the entire thing with barely concealed outrage. Her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest and her face was stiff with anger. I walked over to her slowly, the autumn wind rustling the hem of my jacket. She watched me approach, her jaw clenching tightly. I stopped a few feet away from her and smiled politely. You know, I said softly, tilting my head slightly. It's funny how things work out. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I glanced over my shoulder at the house. My house, then back at her. You always said I wasn't family. I continued. My voice low and calm, but it looks like I'm the only one still living here. And then I smiled, the same way she always had. Sweet and venomous. She didn't say a word. She just turned sharply on her heel and walked away.